Hello and welcome to my channel. In this lecture we'll continue our talk about the cerebellum, so let's begin. We studied the structure of the cerebellum, the cerebellar cortex and parts, and the deep cerebellar nuclei. And today we will talk about the white matter, or the cerebellar afferents and efferents. The afferents means the fibers coming to the cerebellum that will enter the cerebellum. Sources are the cerebrum, the spinal cord, the vestibular nuclei, the red nucleus, and the tectum of the midbrain. From the cerebrum, you can recognize types of fibers like corticopontocerebellar fibers, from the cortex to the pons and then to the cerebellum. Cerebro-olivocerebellar fibers means from the cortex, cerebral cortex, to the olive and to the cerebellum, and cerebro-reticulocerebellar fibers from the cerebrum to the reticular formation, then to the cerebellum. The corticopontocerebellar fibers, example, from the right cerebral cortex to the pontine nuclei, I mean from a side of the cerebral cortex to the pontine nuclei, then it crosses to the other side, or in this case to the left side, the cerebellum, in the middle cerebellar peduncle, and they enter the cerebellum as mossy fibers. Remember, we said any fibers inside the cerebellum except the climbing are mossy fibers. Cerebro-olivocerebellar fibers from the cortex to both olives, mainly the inferior olivary nucleus, then through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and cross and ascend as climbing fibers. Remember, we talked about climbing fibers before. They are the fibers coming from the inferior olive or from the olives. Cerebro-reticulocerebellar fibers from the cortex to bilateral reticular formation in the pons and medulla, then through the middle cerebellar peduncle and inferior cerebellar peduncle, continue inside the cerebellum as mossy fibers. From the spinal cord, anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, and cuneocerebellar. The anterior spinocerebellar from spinal border nucleus, it crosses and then ascends as anterior spinocerebellar. In the superior cerebellar peduncle, it recrosses, which is questionable. And then cerebellum goes through inside the cerebellum as mossy fibers. The posterior or dorsal spinocerebellar arises from the Clark's nucleus. Ascends as posterior spinocerebellar and then enters the inferior cerebellar peduncle and resembles itself in the cerebellum as mossy fibers also. There is no crossing here. The cuneocerebellar, it's the equivalent of Clark's nucleus because it receives the proprioception impulses from the upper limb, the Clark's nucleus from the lower limb, the cuneocerebellar, the accessory cuneate nucleus resembles the Clark's nucleus, receiving the proprioception or information from the upper limb, then through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and goes inside the cerebellum as mossy fibers also. There is no crossing. All tracts carry unconscious proprioception information about the limb involved. From vestibular nuclei, vestibular nerve and nuclei, there are direct fibers from the vestibular nerve, go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, then ascend as mossy fibers inside the cerebellum, then to the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum. The vestibular nuclei send fibers through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, ascends as mossy fibers inside the cerebellum to the flocculonodular lobe as well. From the red nucleus and the tectum, these are fibers that carry information to orient the body through visual input. Cerebellar efferents, they arise from the cerebellar cortex. They are axons of Purkinje cells directly to lateral vestibular nucleus, and then to deep cerebellar nuclei. And not then, I mean also from deep cerebellar nuclei, giving efferent outflow of the cerebellum. There are four paths, major paths: the globose emboliform rubral, or from the nucleus interpositus, actually, to the red nucleus; dentatothalamic fibers from the dentate nucleus to the thalamus; fastigial vestibular from the fastigious nucleus to the vestibular nuclei; and fastigial reticular from fastigial to reticular formation. The globose emboliform rubral, globose and arise from the globose and emboliform nuclei. The fibers cross in the superior cerebellar peduncle, then go to the red nucleus, which give rise to the rubrospinal tract, which recrosses in the ventral tegmental decussation. So it's action exerted on the ipsilateral side. Remember, the superior cerebellar peduncle forms the brachium conjunctivum, where the fibers forming the superior cerebellar peduncle crosses there in the midbrain. Dentatothalamic fibers from the dentate nucleus, which is the biggest nucleus in the cerebellum, and they cross in the superior cerebellar peduncle to the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus mainly, to primary anterior, then from the thalamus to primary area 4, which is the motor area, then from the cortex there, it gives off the corticospinal tract, the majority of which crosses in the medulla oblongata at the level of the motor decussation. Remember, the corticospinal tract. Fastigiovestibular fibers from the fastigial nucleus in the middle of the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the lateral vestibular nucleus of both sides. Then from the vestibular nuclei, it gives off, besides the MLF, it gives off the medial vestibulospinal tract. Or the vestibulospinal tract. Fastigio-reticular fibers from the fastigial nuclei, fastigial nucleus in the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the reticular formation of the brainstem, then fibers from there, from these reticular formation nuclei, descend in the spinal cord as reticulospinal fibers. Functions, you can differentiate the cerebellum into three regions. The vestibulocerebellum, which is called the archicerebellum, where it's present in humans and in primitive animals, which is the flocculonodular lobe. For example, it makes the fish, corrects its position in water, for example. The spinocerebellum, this occurred in animals that acquired limbs to move. It's called the paleocerebellum, and it's the vermis and the paravermis, the area beside the vermis of the cerebellum. And the cerebrocerebellum, this is in human beings, it's called the neocerebellum. which is the lateral zone of the cerebellum, and besides motor functions, it has also other functions like cognitive functions and involved in planning of the motor activity of human beings. So you can differentiate it into vestibulocerebellum, cerebellum, spinocerebellum, and cerebrocerebellum, archi, paleo, and neocerebellum. The vestibulocerebellum, it projects directly to the vestibular nuclei. I told you before in the last lecture that consider the vestibular nuclei as a detached, displaced cerebellar nucleus, and it modifies balance and eye movements, the vestibulocerebellum. The spinocerebellum, this is concerned with the limbs. It influences the medial system, which is the axial muscles, and works through the fastigial nucleus. This is the vermis. So remember, the vermis in the middle works through the middle nucleus, which is the fastigial nucleus, and has three inputs: vestibular, visual, and auditory. The paravermis, next to the vermis, it influences the lateral system. It makes sure that the movements are accurate. It ensures the accuracy of voluntary movements. Acts through the interposed nucleus, globose and imbuliform. And the inputs, receives inputs from the spinal cord, anterior and posterior spinocerebellar and cuneo-cerebellar, which we talked about earlier, and the trigeminal nucleus. The cerebrocerebellum influence is directed to the cerebrum, motor and premotor cortices, because it's involved in planning of the movement. It acts through the dentate nucleus, which is the biggest nucleus, and concerned with motor planning, as mentioned, and receives the input from the corticopontine fibers. Principles of function of the cerebellum. We discussed before, we mentioned before that functions is not only motor, but it's concerned in different aspects of the motor activity and other cognitive functions as well. First of all, it detects disparity. I mean, it receives commands from the cortex and information about the target performance from stretch receptors, the Golgi tendon organs, for example, and mechanoreceptors from joints. Then compares the commands with the performance to detect the errors. i.e. coordination of movement. It coordinates the movement. Incoordination is called ataxia of the limbs if the lateral cerebellum is involved, and of the axial muscles if the medial cerebellum is involved. It times contraction times. Times the contraction of the agonist versus the antagonist, and converts the activity of one muscle into the other smoothly to perform in order to perform complex movements, for example. It also converts short-term feedback into long-term feed forward. Short-term feedback, information from the ongoing movement taking place, and converts it into long-term feed forward, means memory and movement learning, like learning to drive a car, for example. Purkinje cells and deep nuclei fire continuously. The deep nuclei at much higher level or much higher rate than the Purkinje cells, so the output of cells can be modulated. It also damps movements, prevents overshoots of a movement, overcome momentum of movement. This is tested by the nose to finger test, for example. It also controls ballistic movements, controls rapid movements of the body, like typing, saccadic eyes, and watching a moving object. This is controlled by the cerebellum also. And as mentioned, it has a cognitive function, sensory function. It was tested that the dentate nucleus is involved in tactile sensory discrimination. They ask the patient to close the eyes and introduce the hand into one of the boxes that contains different objects of different shapes and sizes, and tells the shape of the structure while measuring the blood flow to the cerebellum. And they found out that when this is performed, blood flow increases in the dentate nucleus, which means that it's involved in tactile sensory discrimination, tactile determining of size and shape of objects. Some of the lesions of the cerebellum: appendicular ataxia. It involves lesion in the lateral cerebellum. There is intentional tremors, like rhythmic shaking of the limb on start to move, on the beginning of the movement. Dysmetria means overshoot or undershoot the target, because there is incoordination of agonist and antagonist muscles. Dysdiadochokinesia, the motor system fails to predict where the different parts of the body during a complex movement, for example, where different parts of the body will be at a given time, so it loses the part during a rapid movement. Dysarthria, inability to articulate speech properly. It involves the rate and volume of speech affected. Also, ipsilateral ataxia, tested by finger-nose test or heel-shin test. Glide your heel on the shin of the other leg. Rapid alternating movements and overshooting tests to detect ipsilateral ataxia. So these are some of the lesions of the cerebellum, in addition to truncal ataxia, which is unsteady drunk-like gait, like a toddler learning to walk, for example. It involves a lesion in the midline cerebellum, and tested by tandem gait, foot in front of the other. The test done by the police to detect drunk drivers or driving under the influence. Blood supply of the cerebellum from the vertebral artery through the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. They supply the inferior surface, from their name, anterior inferior and posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. And from the basilar artery gives off the superior cerebellar artery before giving the terminal branch posterior cerebral to supply the superior surface of the cerebellum. So it's the ICA and PICA for the inferior surface and the superior cerebellar for the superior surface. I hope you got the maximum benefit from this lecture, and thank you very much for watching.